Hey, everybody. We're glad to have you all here. It is a lot of you that's on the call today. Last count was over 800 people that had registered for this particular webinar. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and we've got some great panelists for you today. First panelist that I'll introduce is Tiffany Ross. She is the Commission's first Consumer Resource Officer. So she will be helping us today. She has a background in engineering, both at the Georgia Institute of Technology and Florida State, but she decided to go with her passion, and that's why she's bringing all her skills here to the real estate industry and to the Real Estate Commission. The other panelist that we have is Fred Moreno, which many of you may know. He's been an attorney with the Real Estate Commission for almost 10 years. And whenever I see Fred, I always get very jealous because I'm just reminded of my own past failures. Fred graduated with high honors from my alma mater, law school, and I only graduated with honors because I don't know, for some reason my wife and I decided to have a kid my first year of law school, and my grades did not, my grades showed that I had a kid my first year of law school. Anyway, we are very excited to have Fred on with us today, and for these two panelists to help you over. I've had a couple of hotline calls over the last, week and a half, 2 weeks when this class was announced. I know some of you are on here and you were calling because you had already been experiencing problems with these particular scams. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Tiffany.
All right, thank you, John. And so I am going to share my screen, and we are going to start our presentation on land scams and other fraud alerts. And so, as John just mentioned, you all are probably very familiar now with the latest and greatest in scams that are happening in our industry. And we want to talk about what we're hearing here at the Commission, some of the things that we've seen, and what you can do to avoid becoming a victim, and what to do if you have already become a victim. And so we're going to start here. Last year, a new type of scam began to emerge, and that was fake sellers listing land for sale. And this is not just listing as for sale by owner, which that is one of the scams that they've done, but they are even contacting you all, real estate brokers, to assist them with this scam. And so we're going to discuss with you how to spot a fake seller if someone is trying to contact you and get you to be a part of their transaction, and what to do if you're contacted. And at this point, we are going to first watch a brief video, and then Fred is going to take you on from there.
A lot of us scroll through home buying sites like Zillow just to pass time or look because we're curious, right? A Raleigh man was doing that and found a listing for his own property.
Yeah, and it turns out a scammer stole his identity. WREL's Keenan Willard went to the property to hear how John Arnold avoided a very serious loss.
So this is what happened. A man reached out to real estate agents in Raleigh and gave them this ID, saying his name was John Arnold and he wanted to sell this land. There was only one problem, though. This isn't John Arnold, and he nearly got away with running a six-figure scam. Realtor Cindy Roberts got a message from a man named John Arnold. He said he was looking to sell his property on Tanager Street and sent her this ID to prove he was the landowner.
So we chatted very briefly on the phone, but it was very brief. He did have a heavy accent, which I did kind of wonder about.
Roberts listed the property, and she quickly got 2 offers on the land. That's when things took a turn.
It evidently hit Zillow. So the real John Arnold gave me a call.
The real John Arnold is a Raleigh resident who's owned this property for 40 years, but he hadn't reached out to Roberts to sell. Another real estate agent had sent him the listing, saying he'd also been contacted by someone claiming to be Arnold. The man's suspicious story led the realtor to believe this ID was fake.
It just wasn't adding up in my mind, and that's why I just asked for that further. Because I've seen this in other parts of the country.
And he got all my ID.
I mean, that's your actual driver's license number.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Arnold was able to have the listing taken off Zillow, and he contacted the Wake Sheriff's Office, who told him to file a complaint with the FBI. Arnold says he's relieved the property wasn't sold out from under him. Roberts says a check of the scammer's IP address showed he'd been contacting her from Africa. She's now going to require a face-to-face conversation for any future deals at her agency.
Absolutely. Because obviously a document isn't going to be good enough anymore.
Keenan Willard, WREL News.
All right. Well, thank you, Tiffany. So that's sort of our intro to show you that even here in Raleigh, in our backyard, right, that this is happening. Good afternoon. I am Fred Moreno. I'm Chief Deputy Legal Counsel with the Commission. Tiffany Ross is here with us as well, and John Waite with the Realtors. So we appreciate you all being here. We're here because we know there's a problem. Typically, when we do these kind of webinars, it's very reactionary, but we hear from brokers on the front lines as to what they're dealing with. And you have news outlets like this that are picking up the stories to help us in educating the consumers to let them know as well. So what is happening here, right? We kind of evolved. I mean, fraud and these kind of schemes have been a part of our lives forever, right? I mean, but we've sort of evolved from the Nigerian prince who's asking you to wire money overseas, right? We've kind of evolved from the people asking you to get out of jury duty if you go to Target and buy a bunch of gift cards and mail it to them. We're in a point now where we have people that can seem very legitimate, as you've heard in the broker in that news outlet, and they're getting very creative in the way that they are perpetuating their schemes here. And in North Carolina, we're seeing this everywhere. This is not just in Raleigh. This is actually mostly, from what we're understanding, happening in the coastal areas. This is happening in Wilmington. It's happening in the mountains. It's happening in Murphy. A lot of these issues are dealing with vacant land, and they're trusting these schemers are knowing that brokers a lot of times are busy, and a lot of times brokers will get phone calls, legitimate phone calls, from owners or people believing that they're owners to list properties for sale who they cannot meet. They cannot show up face to face. They can't come knock on your door. A lot of people are working virtually now. So this is kind of, the stars have kind of aligned and allowed this to sort of seep in. And the purpose of this today is to tell you about this scheme, hopefully give you some tips that you can walk away with, that you can instill in your firms and offices and educate your colleagues, and let them know of some red flags to look for. So Tiffany, if you can advance. This is also happening, as I said, not just in North Carolina, but across the country, as we'll see. So who's being affected in this? Well, of course, actually the property owners. I mean, can you imagine like this guy, John Arnold, having a property for 40 years and then someone letting him know, hey, I didn't know you were selling your property. Can you imagine what that's going? You know, is this his dad's property, his grandfather's property? And all of a sudden he sees a listing for sale. So of course the owners are being affected by this. Real estate brokers, you're sort of the instrument that's being used to perpetuate this issue. Buyers, of course, buyers coming, saving up, putting down, especially in the markets that we've seen, thousands of dollars in due diligence to try to secure a contract, who they believe is the owner, who everyone believes is the owner. That money is going away. So buyers are being impacted. Attorneys, closing attorneys, not realizing until they get to the closing, you know, that this isn't a legitimate seller. Lenders sending this money, wiring these funds to the closing attorneys. Register of Deeds, you know, we have an issue we've seen lately with different kinds of agency agreements and other services being filed in deeds, which we've done some legislation with, and we can touch on that later. But all of these players are involved in many of these schemes.
All right. And so now we have another video coming up next on this slide that tells you what to do or how it works.
Price says the scam works like this. The fraudster looks up the ownership records of a vacant property online, impersonates the owner, then hires a real estate agent to list the property for sale. The scammer will then push for a cash sale under market value in the hopes of closing quickly and making off with all of the buyer's funds. Tom Kite says the scam is happening all across the nation, particularly with commercially zoned properties where vacant land might be worth more than a residential lot. He says it's an easy target for fraudsters because owners may not think about their property until they're ready to build or improve it.
So what is a broker to do? What would the commission expect a broker to do in these situations? Well, let's take a look at what some of the rules require, right? Now you have North Carolina general statutes. This is what the commission could discipline a broker for their failure under these instances. One is making a willful or negligent misrepresentation or willful or negligent omission of material fact. Well, if you're listing a property for somebody that's not really the owner, well, you're making a misrepresentation, right? It's not the true owner. The commission could also discipline a broker for pursuing a course of misrepresentation through agents, advertising, or otherwise. This is typically where we have a misrepresentation. You're not just putting a for sale sign out, but now you're putting it on the MLS. Or you're putting it on Facebook and actively marketing it out to a wide audience through your advertising. The catch-all we always have is number 8, being unworthy or incompetent to act as a real estate broker in a manner as to endanger the interests of the public. The public is being harmed here. The actual legitimate sellers of the property are being harmed. In some cases, transactions are actually going through. And they have to, be unwound or undone when it's found later. And then also there's number 10, any conduct which constitutes improper, fraudulent, or dishonest dealing. Well, a lot of times the brokers aren't the ones perpetuating the fraud. They're not the fraudster, so to speak, in this. But the conduct that they have may be improper because there may be red flags that they should have, asked more questions, or they should have done more due diligence and they failed to do. So that's sort of some of the issues where a broker would have issues, and the commission may have issues with a broker in their due diligence. We'll get to what some of those red flags are in a minute. Next, we'll talk about these commission rules. So first I talked about the statutes. General statutes with the General Assembly has passed and said the commission can take disciplinary action on. Now we get specifically to the rules that are codified in the Administrative Procedure Act. Rule 104, you must have an agreement to sell real estate signed by the owner of that real estate if you're listing the property, right? In this case, you don't have a signed agreement from a legitimate owner. Another rule, another part of 104, I believe, is also going over that working with real estate agents brochure. You need to go over this after first substantial contact. You'll see in the bottom part of that, well, what happens if it's a phone call? Many of these you're not going to see them face to face, so you're going to get the phone call. Well, then you have that 3-day period. That would be your first substantial contact, would be that phone call. So then you have that 3-day period. You need to mail it to them or otherwise submit it to them and review, not just hand it to them or put it as a tagline on your auto signature. You need to also review it with them. That is a commission rule. Also, we have Rule 105, which talks about the advertising. Cannot advertise for sale or for rent, again, without the written consent of the owner. This is the actual legitimate owner of the property. So again, to reiterate, the listing agents, you need to ensure that the listing agreements you have are in writing. You need to have your due diligence of trying to meet owners face to face, in person, or by video. A lot of these, as I mentioned, and you'll see in the news clips, are people that call. Most people nowadays have a smartphone. So maybe something you can do is try to do a FaceTime video. One thing I noticed in that clip from Raleigh was this John Arnold. If you looked at the driver's license, and although all the information on that driver's license may have been correct, the number, the address, all of that, because it was maybe some identity theft that happened. But if you look at the picture, the guy was bald in that driver's license picture, and the John Arnold that was being interviewed had a full set of hair. So that would have been something if you would have had a face-to-face, either on, in person or on video, on a FaceTime video or Zoom like we are here, you would have been able to figure that out. Verify that ownership, check those IDs as best as you can. The commission will not require you to be a forensic FBI agent to be able to really discern on what is a legitimate or illegitimate government issued ID. They are getting very crafty, but take those steps. It's another step. Have an office policy. And so when somebody calls, says, well, why are you singling me out? And you can say, no, this is what we do. This is our policy, blanket policy for everybody. Visit the property, check it out, get in your car, drive down there, take a look at it. If you see some neighbors out there, talk with them. A lot of times, actually, the neighbors are the ones who alert the owners and say, hey, I found out you're selling your property. Why didn't you tell me? Well, if you're out there and meet one of the owners, well, maybe they will talk with the legitimate, or one of the neighbors, excuse me, they might talk to the legitimate owner first and let you know and give them a business card, and they can call you and say, hey, you're not talking with the right person. If you do feel that there is a scam going on, please contact law enforcement. The FBI specifically has, you can see here the information, and Tiffany can also go over that with you as to who to contact, but they have a task force set up for this because it is becoming an issue. Buyer agents, on the other hand, also, you have some due diligence to do as well. You need to check with the listing agent to ensure that this is the right seller. What verification procedures have you done? If you see any of the suspicious issues, request for a copy of that identification. If you're unsure, educate your clients about these issues, let them know. Firms can have policies. I know some firms have, and also closing attorneys have now included a lot of times in packets about wire fraud, just a blanket statement to say you need to be careful about these things. Real estate brokers and firms can also include those kind of policies when you're talking about vacant land. And those kinds of things. Ask attorneys, the closing attorneys, about identifying, did you meet? Was this a mail away closing? A few of the red flags, especially that we've seen, is you're going to get a phone call. Typically, you're not going to have somebody that wants to come and meet you. They're going to come up with some kind of story to say, I need to unload with this property. One of my family members is in the hospital. I'm in California or I'm in Arizona. I can't make it to North Carolina. Sometimes that's legitimate. Sure you all have had those clients that are trying to sell property from out of state. Try the FaceTime video. Try a Zoom call. Try to ask some of those questions and see if you get pushback. If you get pushback, that may be a red flag. Visit the property. If there's something you notice, like a storage shed or something on a vacant land that's there, quiz that person and ask him if there's anything particular on that property that you need to be aware of. And you may find out they have no idea what the property even looks like. These are types of questions that brokers can do. These are types of red flags, especially if you're listing a property, let's say in Raleigh, 1 acre vacant land, and they want to list it for $700,000. And then the first offer you get in is for $50,000, and the person is just like, okay, let's do it. Who would sell it for $50,000? That difference off the list price, and be okay with that off the bat, that should be a red flag as well as to what they're willing to let the property go for. Those are some things that we've seen. These are some of the responsibilities of a broker. I do want to address some of your concerns that you may have in, well, what happens if I do these steps, Fred? What happens if I put these policies in place and my brokers ask for these things and we get driver's licenses? We have a person and we meet with them and they legitimately look like the person. And it turns out that it's just such an elaborate scheme and identity theft that it falls through the cracks. Will the commission come after me? Will I be put in real estate jail? Well, we look at every complaint. We look at the legitimacy of it. We look at what the brokers did. We look at the due diligence. If you are part of an elaborate scheme that you've tried everything, you've checked every box, and it still went through past you, the commission will take that into consideration. We don't expect you to be forensic FBI agents, but we do expect you to watch for red flags, perform your due diligence. Under these things, make sure that you have the accurate, complete transaction records. Cooperate with the auditors that are investigating if a complaint is filed. Report the fraud to the FBI or local law enforcement as soon as you know. Notify the sellers, notify the buyers or their agents that this is going on, that this happened, or you have some concerns.
Yeah. All right. And so thanks, Brent. So speaking of notifying, if you find that you have been a victim, if you find out that someone has convinced you to list a property and you're somewhere in the transaction and you discover that it is in fact a fake seller, then the first step is, of course, to make some notifications. You need to notify all the parties in the transaction. So all the parties on your side, your actual clients, the parties on the other side of the transaction, the attorney, the lenders, any other service providers. Everyone needs to be notified, because how this person or what this person is up to and how they're trying to get into the transaction, it could come from any of these providers. And so they all need to be notified that something has happened or that the transaction has been impacted, and that there's a fake seller, buyer, scammer in the transaction somewhere. You also need to notify the FBI, and they have a website. It's ic3.gov, and it's designed specifically for fraud. Not just wire fraud or real estate fraud, but all kinds of fraud. There's fraud going on against elders. There's fraud against companies. So this website is specifically designed to receive complaints if you are a victim of some type of fraud. And real estate transactions, about $19 billion have been stolen in just real estate transactions over the past several years. So that is a huge part of the fraud that is happening and how we are being impacted. And then the last thing is, well, not last, make sure you make all these notifications very quickly, but notify your local law enforcement. So that does include police, that can include your local sheriff's department, and your local SBI, your State Bureau of Investigation. So make sure that you make all the notifications that you can so that everyone is aware and they can all take steps to protect themselves, to verify that their computer has not been impacted in some way. And here's other ways to protect yourself.
Agent a lot of questions about the seller.
As a buyer, really ask the questions around, have you met the seller? How did this listing come through? If you're working with a real estate agent as a buyer, make sure that they're asking these questions of the listing agent.
Also, be wary of a seller willing to accept an offer below market value in exchange for a quick cash sale. And never allow a seller to arrange their own notary closing. Make sure you use a trusted title company or closing attorney to coordinate the exchange of closing documents and funds.
All right. And so those are ways to protect yourself, questions to ask, and things to do. Now, a couple other best practices, and Fred touched on some of these earlier, but it doesn't hurt to hear them again. Make sure that you stay up to date on the latest warnings or alerts. NCREC is putting out warnings. You will see news reports like the ones that we've shown in this presentation. And your local, state, and national realtor boards, they are putting out articles and alerts and bulletins and all kinds of ways to inform you about what's happening. So make sure you take the time to educate yourself and learn about what's going on and how to avoid it happening to you and in your transaction. As Fred mentioned earlier, always request a face-to-face meeting. What you'll find is that if this person is in fact a scammer, they will avoid it at all costs. They will give you every excuse under the sun to avoid meeting face-to-face if they are in fact not the legitimate owner of the property. So again, watching for those red flags, and maybe consider making it an office policy and insist that if they can't meet in person, that it has to be a face-to-face virtual meeting. So you can see who you're talking to, who you're dealing with, and you can have a chance to do a little bit of investigation on your end. Number 2, visit the property, ask tester questions. So like Fred mentioned, if you see a shed, ask about it. Or another way to test is if there is no shed, ask about the shed on the property. The property owner will say, what shed? There's no shed on the property. But someone who has no idea, they will start trying to come up with a story about the shed that doesn't exist. So again, tester questions one way or the other about the property itself to test their knowledge on if they're familiar with the property. The third thing recommended is to get a copy of that ID and verify it against the deed. And use your social media, use Google, try to Google the person and see if there's a picture, a photo, an image that comes up. There's so much on the internet now. There's ways for you to look a person up and see if the person on social media matches the person on the ID. So again, we're not trying to convince you to become or try to attempt to become investigators, but we do want you to step up your game for your protection and for your client's protection in these transactions. So you can do a little more due diligence to make sure that you're dealing with the correct person. And if you are savvy enough, if you even know what an IP address is and how to check them, you could check out the IP address and verify that the client says that they are, or verify their location, that they are where they say they are. So IP addresses will indicate if they're in the country or what state they're in. So if someone's telling you that they're calling you from Chicago and they're there with their significant other having cancer treatment, and then you check and the IP address is in Alabama, that could be a red flag that they're not who they say they are, or that they're not telling you the truth about their location. So these are just some things that you can do to begin to protect yourself and to look out for red flags in a transaction. Another way that you can protect yourself is to continue to educate yourself. Now, NCREC has partnered with the Bar Association and the Investors Title Group, and we have put together a wire fraud conference. This is a type of CE that attorneys, paralegals, and real estate brokers can attend for CE credit. And we've had these wire fraud conferences going on since March. There's 3 remaining, so we highly recommend that you consider attending one of these. They go into a lot of detail about the intricacies of the scams that are being purported, as well as prevention tactics, things to look for, red flags, and also what your liability is as a broker and attorneys if you attend as an attorney. And then what the opportunities are for recovery. So although $19 billion have been stolen, the recovery of it has been almost 70%. So if you respond quickly enough, if you respond and get the FBI involved, if you get the word out, there is a high chance of recovery in these wire fraud and other types of seller fraud scams. But the key there is knowing that there has been a intrusion and then responding quickly to it instead of trying to dig your head in the sand or ignore that there's something wrong. So we want to educate you. We want you to be prepared to act quickly if you do discover that there is some sort of fraudulent activity taking place in your transaction. And then we have a few additional fraud warnings. So in addition to the vacant land scams, there are some other fraud types that are emerging right now as well. The first one is notary and deed fraud. Now, in this situation, you may receive a notarized document, but the question is, who is verifying the notary? Scammers have figured out that the attorneys don't verify the notary if they receive a notarized document. And so they're providing false notarized documents that are being recorded. The Register of Deeds, they don't verify the notary. And so if a falsely notarized document is provided and recorded, then that scammer has successfully succeeded in transferring the property out of the rightful owner's name and into a false name or someone else who's involved in that scheme. And so there's notary and deed fraud that's happening. A way to protect yourself and your clients is to warn and alert them about this type of fraud. Have them to check the Register of Deeds in their county to see if they have property notification or fraud alerts. And if so, to register to receive a notification if a document is recorded against their property. And so that's one type of fraud that has, again, begun to emerge in this area. And we want to put that warning out about it. The second type is a wholesaling warning. Now, we're not saying that wholesaling is illegal or that if someone is wholesaling, they're doing anything wrong. The warning specifically here is about someone who is a wholesaler who puts a contract on a property for a small amount of a due diligence fee, maybe $500 or $1,000, and then they fail to complete the transaction. But if that property owner does not terminate in writing once it's not completed, the wholesaler may then go and file a lien against the property because they have a valid contract, even though it didn't close on time. And so then when that seller wants to go and sell their property to someone else, there's a lien that now has to be satisfied. And the wholesaler is asking for far more than they originally invested in their original contract. And so that's the warning, where they might have invested $500 or $1,000, but then they're asking for multiple thousands of dollars to release the lien. So we want people to be aware of that and to follow up if the transaction does not close with a written termination to avoid the opportunity for the lien to be placed on their property. And finally, the rental fraud. So in addition to fake sellers and fake buyers, there's also fake landlords, and they are putting all kinds of ads out for people to send security deposits or rental deposits or application fees, anything that they can get people to send them, and so that they can, of course, disappear with the funds once they have been transferred. So we want to make you aware that all of these are things that are emerging and that are happening in this market that we're receiving calls about, in some cases almost daily, some sort of fraud or a scam. All right, and so we do have 2 additional videos that we wanted to share with you about scams. These are both local videos, one about a man in Durham who was scammed, and then one about a woman in Wake County. And so we're going to play both of these videos for you and then open up for questions. It looks like this video has a ad in the front of it. So while we're waiting for that ad, I will just reiterate here, in this case, the man actually did proceed with and purchase the property and then later discovered that it was not a legitimate sale. So it's going to be up here in just a moment. I apologize for that delay.
We greatly prefer the trees to having houses over there.
Chris Freeman loves his Durham home that sits on a golf course. When looking out his backyard, he wants to keep the trees he sees as opposed to anything else being built.
So we always said we moved in if we had the chance. We could not do it. And so a friend up the street saw the listing that they had texted me, and I got in touch with my agent.
The less than acre property behind Chris's property was listed for sale this past summer by a Chapel Hill agent.
I think it was on the market a day or two before we had an offer in, and then took several days, but that it was accepted.
The listing agent sent this email to Chris's agent, telling Chris to wire the $10,000 due diligence to the seller in Vietnam. Before wiring the money, you can see in these texts, Chris questioned sending this money that way, texting,
Why isn't the money going into escrow until we close? Wiring to Asia seems shady.
Due diligence and
But Chris says his
you
agent
have
was
to give some
assured by
money
the
up front.
listing agent it was fine.
And this money was wired off to Vietnam.
The deal continued to move forward, and at closing, Chris paid more than $20,000 for the property. The closing documents state the seller of the property, now in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Closed mid-August, like celebrated. We own the lot. Super pumped about that.
But about a month after closing, Chris got a call from his agent.
That listing was fraudulent. You don't own that lot. The people that own it aren't the ones that sold it.
Well, the name of the seller on the closing documents matches the records with Durham County on who owns a property that was listed for sale. Chris says the listing agent never verified they were actually talking to the real owner, just someone claiming to be the owner. The closing attorney still had the money Chris gave at closing, so he did get that money back, but he was still out almost 12 grand, which included his due diligence money, plus some of the fees and taxes he paid. Chris says he wanted the listing agency to reimburse him for his loss, since they did not verify the property they listed for sale was by the actual owner.
I can't for the life of me figure out why they would expect me to just eat the cost of their mistake.
After not getting results, Chris got in touch with me and I reached out to the listing agent of the property and her firm.
Yeah.
They didn't get back to me, but the broker in charge at the firm did send Chris this email where it stated they exhausted their appeals with their errors and omissions insurance and would be taking care of this themselves. She also apologized for how long it's taken. Within a week, Chris got this check for just under 12 grand, which makes him whole. He's happy. He has all of his money back, but hopes it's an eye-opener to others.
I want other people to know that real estate fraud is an issue.
To protect your money in a real estate deal, if you find a listing for sale by owner, be very leery directly wiring any money to that owner. Instead, try and go through a proper closing and then put the money in escrow. And even if you do go through a real estate agent, like in this case, if you spot any red flags, speak up right away, as you still can get duped even going through all the proper channels. I'm troubleshooter Diane Wilson, ABC 11 Eyewitness News.
All right. And so that is the first video that we wanted to share with you.
You're looking
About-
pleased with yourself.
Well, not to brag, but I just switched my whole family.
Sorry about that. So that was the first video, and that happened in Durham. And so you'll notice that the outcome was that the firm and or the agent had to recompensate that client back for their lost due diligence fund. So in addition to people being harmed, the agents and the firms are also being harmed in these types of scams and these types of transactions. So we wanted to share that with you and warn you about that in preparation for you watching out for becoming a victim of a scam. And so let me share the screen here with you again. And we have an additional video. This is the Wake County video. So there's the link here in the slide, but I'm not going to play this one yet. We can watch it if we have enough time at the end, but I do want to save time for questions first. So just to let you know that you will have access to these slides and all of the links in the presentation. There is, in addition to this one, other useful information. There was a bulletin article published back in December from the Real Estate Commission. And that article is linked here that will give you some details about types of scams that have happened, that have been reported, and specific steps that you can take in each one of those types of scams. There's also an article from a, was it Greensboro, Fred? There's a Association of Realtors that has another article about land scams that they also released. And then we have an audio report from Utah. So remember, this is happening all over the country. And so there's a report in Utah about a vacant land scam that was very interesting, what took place and how to avoid it through a Zillow listing. All right. And then we are now going to open it up for Q&A. And so if anyone has questions, we welcome you to ask those now. And John, you're on mute. So if you wanted to unmute.
Yeah, sorry. I'm going to go ahead and address the Q&As. If you have a question, drop it into the Q&A box. There's a Q&A button down at the bottom that you can do that. And we have 11 open questions right now. Again, my name is John Waite, lawyer with Martin and Gifford, general counsel to NC Realtors. And I have a couple of questions, a couple of follow-up questions, and I'll also go through the Q&As that are already listed. Some of them I might answer, and some of them I'll turn it over to Tiffany and Fred. So the first question is, my firm requires us to look at the deed no matter what. Do you think that's sufficient? And I think that, the slides, which you guys will have access to, show that you got to do more than that. No, just looking at the deed is not going to tell you anything about whether the person you're dealing with is actually the actual owner or not. You're going to have several more steps to take before you get to that. As far as the next question has to do, what if it's an estate? What information can you ask for to prove ownership? That's going to be very, very tricky. Estate transactions are sticky anyway. My standard answer when people call the legal hotline, the NC Realtors legal hotline, which by the way, might be one of your best resources in these situations. If you have any red flags about whether the person you're dealing with is real or not, call the hotline. We will walk you through it. Call the commission's hotline. They'll walk you through it. You have time and ability to be able to do these things, and some of you have already. But when it comes to estate property, my common answer on the hotline is probably need to get a closing attorney involved now at the beginning of the transaction, because you need to verify that the seller actually has title. And so they're going to be the same regardless of this. Hopefully with estate property, whoever the heirs are, whoever the sellers are, you'll be able to verify them personally most of the time, either in face-to-face chat or in person. Either one. I think a lot of the suggestions from Fred and Tiffany also apply to estate property. At the end of the day, the seller's the seller. How they got the property, it might vary, but that's what you're trying to do. All right. So Tiffany and Fred, you guys touched on this a little bit. The next question is, what about wholesaling? Like, I don't know if you can give a little bit more detail than what you've already given as far as what kind of verification needs to happen to make sure that someone who's claiming to be a wholesaler actually owns the property, because getting contracts, documents, ID, some of that might be difficult depending on the wholesaler.
Right. So wholesaling is a different sort of animal, so to speak. As Tiffany said, it is illegal. It's very interesting. So for those that don't know, typically what we've seen with wholesalers is somebody will go under contract to purchase a property, and then a lot of times they would want to assign that to somebody else and get paid a fee. And ultimately what they're doing is having somebody else step in their shoes as the buyer of that property. In other cases, we've seen where the wholesaler will purchase the property and want to go ahead and line up somebody that they want to buy it or sell it to, and they would do a double closing that day. That's really the more legitimate way, sort of, so to speak, to do it, because you have a closing occur and then you have another closing. It's been kind of difficult because the question always comes up, well, under our rules, if you're going to list a property for sale, you have to have a listing agreement with the owner of the property. Well, the wholesaler's not the owner of the property at that point. They're under contract to buy it, but they're not the owner of the property. So you would need to have an agency agreement with the owner of the property if you're listing it for sale. There has been, the commission has said before that if a person, we've seen this with investments, if a person is buying a property and they want to go ahead and line up tenants as an investment property, they could list it for rent. But as always, that's been allowed. But the disclosure has to be made as the listing agent to say that this person does not own this property yet. So you have to have that disclosure, because at some time it could fall through. They could back out. They could not close. Closing could be delayed. And then you're left with tenants that aren't able to move in. So you have to have those disclosures. that may not answer all of your questions there, but it brings up more questions, I think, when you're dealing with wholesaling. Certainly, if you're trying to list something as a wholesale, and the comment mentioned they wouldn't give you a copy of it, I wouldn't list it, right? I mean, I have nothing to go on by what this person is claiming. So I would certainly push for documentation to try to get something there.
I'll also add this, in my experience with wholesalers, not all wholesalers are created equal. Some of them are reputable companies that are actually doing this in compliance with the license law. And some of them are seriously fly by night that won't think twice about breaching any contract they might have to make slightly more profit on a second contract. So I would just say, whenever you're dealing with a wholesaler, you're going to want a lot of verification anyway, that they have the ability to deliver title in a dual closing. So it's those transactions inherently have more risks. If you're going to take those risks, then you need to be able to plan against them accordingly, and frankly accept them. So just understand that's part of the calculus. All right, the next two questions have to do with the fact that, and I'm sure you guys would agree, not everything you've suggested today is foolproof. Checking IDs, not foolproof. Checking deeds, not foolproof. There is nothing foolproof, right?
Right.
And so, and I don't think that's really what's being said today. I think what the point today is, you need to first do your due diligence on it, and make sure you do as much as you can to possibly verify that the person you're dealing with is actually the person that you're trying to deal with, and two, document it. Do those two things. And if you do those two things, like Fred said, they're not expecting you to be, experts in any of this stuff. There's actually a question on here too that says, should I be comparing the signatures on the contract to the deed? Well, maybe, maybe that's helpful. Maybe it's not. I can tell you that it's kind of interesting. I was actually in a jury trial as a juror one time, having to deal with the issue of whether someone signed something or not, looking at it. And it is a very inexact science for a layperson. I'm sure there are experts out there who can do it pretty well, but I can tell you, as someone who's tried to do that with no experience or training whatsoever, it is very difficult. And my own signature varies widely as to how lazy I'm being a particular day, So as far as like trying to again, nothing is going to be bulletproof. You got to take all these things as a whole and do as many of them as you possibly can, to be able to be confident that who you're dealing with is not trying to scam everybody. Skipping down here. Somebody asked a very specific question about the E&O in the video, and the E&O not providing coverage. Again, speaking from personal experience with clients, E&Os are no different than any other insurance company. They love denying coverage, because when they deny coverage, they make money. So, it's one of those things where you may need to get an attorney involved if your E&O denies coverage. And some of these losses on these fake seller scams are pretty big, or wire fraud scams, even bigger. So just, don't be surprised if that happens. That's probably a little bit beyond the scope of this, but what I would say is, if you run into that situation, you're not completely out of luck. It just may be something where you have to hire legal counsel to write a nasty gram to your insurance company, maybe even consider litigation to get them to do what they have agreed to do in their contract.
And John, I see a question about, does every county in North Carolina offer the fraud alerts for the deed protection? And in fact, all the counties do not. There are 60 counties currently that do. And so it's worth taking a look at your county to find out if yours is one of those counties.
That's a good point. Someone else had mentioned it's hard for, for example, in the John Arnold situation, people aren't actively out there. If you're not selling your property, you're not actively out there looking and Googling your property. I'm not Googling my address to see if it's out there. I mean, it could be, but I'm not checking it. So what I've also heard some people do is they can set up Google alerts with their property address, and it'll notify you if your address comes up on something. That may be something that you can tell some of your clients about, especially if you recently just listed a home for sale and purchased the new buyers, and let them know because that might be like a recent, they can access if they're trying to mimic like the rental scam we saw where they took legitimate listings and put really low rental amounts to get the traffic in. And so what a lot of rental managers did was they started putting verbiage on their images that said, this is not for sale, or this is, here's my number. Don't, contact me if you see this. So try to do some Google alerts of the property. Also, we mentioned the working with real estate agents brochure. You have that 3-day period to send it to them and go over. So that may also be an opportunity to say, hey, John Doe that's calling me, I need your address because I need to send you this working with real estate agents brochure, and I need to go over it with you. So send that to me. And whatever address they give, you may be able to look at the real estate on the county website. And a lot of times, if they don't live in there, if it's an investment property, they'll have the owner mailing address. And that may also be another layer that you can cross-reference. Why is he giving me this address in West Virginia when the owner's mailing address is over in Wilmington? So just another layer that you can do.
I think that's a really excellent point. There's a question on here that basically asks, doesn't the escrow agent bear the brunt of the accountability since they're the ones that have to prepare the settlement documentation? I think the simple answer to that is no. If you get in one of these transactions and if you haven't taken the steps to verify who you're dealing with, what's going to happen is everybody's going to create a big crap sandwich, and then if it all goes bad, everyone's going to have to take a bite of it. That's all there is to it. I mean, there's no innocent parties. Buyer agents may have the least amount, depending on if it's a fake seller scam, the buyer agent may have the least amount of exposure in these transactions. But as far as just trying to place everything on the closing attorney, escrow agent, whatever, no, that's probably not going to fly when it comes to liability anyway, and probably not with respect to discipline. Kelly Marks, who's the chair of the Risk Management Issues Committee for NAR in North Carolina, he shared that on May 9th at 10:30, there's going to be a meeting in DC. I think it must be available via Zoom, I'm assuming. And everyone's invited to attend that. They'll have an FBI agent present, and they're going to go over a bunch of things, including artificial intelligence and cyber security. So just wanted to make you aware of that. Kelly, thanks for sharing that. Let's see. This is a question that was asked, and it's a question that I also have, so I'll ask it to you guys. On the fake buyer side, what are they getting out of this? Like, how did they make money? Like, it's sort of confusing to me how they do. Do you guys have any insight on why we're seeing fake buyers?
Sure. Okay, so on the fake buyer side, what they are after is they are trying to stall just long enough to not have to pay any due diligence funds and see if they can get a quick transaction to close and have the attorney send them the some sort of a proceed from the transaction. So fake buyers, what they're trying to do is hold up the transaction. They are putting in offers to get the property off the market, and then delaying making any kind of payments or something to try to send false instructions to the attorney for the proceeds at the end of the transaction. So they'll delay due diligence and they'll say something has come up and can we just handle it all at the closing, with the intention that the false documentation has been sent to the attorney to send proceeds to this fake buyer instead. So I mean, these scams, they're very intense, some of them, and they have a lot of players that are a part of the entire transaction.
So somehow, some way, they're trying to create a situation in the closing statement where they would be due some money if they can get the transaction to go through, and then they'll be able to do it. So I would say, there's been a couple questions on this in the chat. To me, a red flag would be if you have a buyer, number one, that's looking to avoid any upfront costs, no inspections, no due diligence fee, maybe not even wanting to put earnest money in deposit, right? If you're getting any of those red flags, then you probably need to look into whether you got a fake buyer on your hands or not. And especially if they're, if you could see them kind of maneuvering in their offer and contract negotiations to try and create a surplus on the bottom line in their favor on the closing statement, then those are definitely all red flags where you're going to want to do a better job of verifying the identity of your buyer. So there's a couple of questions in here about policy and procedure manuals. I forgive me if I said this already, but there's been a couple mentions already about maybe doing a policy. I would make it even stronger. Make a policy. Because if you're a broker in charge and you're not doing a good enough job supervising your brokers underneath you on this topic, like any other license law topic, you could be subject to discipline yourself. So to me, a firm policy is, yes, it's not required, but I would strongly encourage you, if you don't have a policy and procedure manual, to get one in writing, even if it's simple. Doesn't have to be that complicated, but simple stuff that goes over these sorts of things, that sets out expectations in black and white, and then make sure you enforce it, with your agents that are underneath you. And just so everyone's aware, we got 3 minutes remaining. I'm trying to push through as many of these Q&As as I can. If you have follow-ups, all of you are realtors on this call, so you can call the Realtor Legal Hotline if you need to, or email the legal hotline, or the commission also has their phones open too at all times. So you can also call them if you have any follow-up questions. Again, a reminder, this slide presentation will be sent out, and I believe the video also will be available. So this is being recorded. So for all time, my awkward Midwestern accent voice will be available to you and your listening pleasure. Anyway, all right. Let's see. I'm trying to look for maybe one or two more questions in here if we could do them quick. Oh, this is interesting, and I don't know the answer to this. Do you know has there been any software created or developed, like apps or things like that, to try and address this at all? Are you guys aware of anything? I guess I'm not, but I didn't know if you knew anything.
To try and address what are we
trying to address, like discover that someone is fake, like a fake party to the transaction?
I'm not aware of any, unless law enforcement has any of that stuff. But again, just to reiterate, I think the purpose of this and what the commission will want the brokers is, this is more of an education. Hey, this is happening, right? And we want brokers to spread the word, especially, and it's not just limited to this, but the majority of it is vacant land. Spread the word with your agents to be on the lookout. When you get a vacant land listing, try to do these things. Try to get an in-person meeting, get a government ID, get these things and check these boxes. Absolutely, if it's legitimate, if it is an identity theft issue, if it's legitimate looking documents, it will be hard for the commission to hold a broker accountable for an organized scheme. But we have seen cases where listing agents say, okay, well, you need to send, you need to send the due diligence, or the seller says, I want the due diligence sent to this wire. I know that that's starting to happen. I haven't seen a lot of wires going for due diligence. Usually it's just a check, but the wire bounced. It didn't work. So the seller came back and said, oh, we'll try this wire. Well, a different bank tried that one. It bounced back. They went through about 4 times until the buyer's wire finally went through, and I think it's those kinds of instances of like, okay, that should be piquing your interest as a listing agent. So why do you keep sending me multiple wires of different banks? It's not going through, right? So it's just a matter of understanding this is out there, doing your due diligence, checking the boxes, looking for those red flags. If it feels bad in your gut, something is probably wrong. So ask questions, and you'll notice when you really start to ask questions and you start getting pushback, that's when things fall apart and you don't hear from that person again.
I would also add this to the question about apps or software to try and address this whole problem. Sometimes the best solutions are old fashioned. Old technology, exists because, it was effective at one time, and sometimes it's still very effective. For example, there's often situations where you're going to want to look at doing a check instead of wire fraud, or sorry, not a wire fraud, a wire transfer to avoid wire fraud, right? And there's one final question here that I'll end on. I'll go ahead and answer it. And the question is, what's the protection for agents? Is there anything that'll help you other than E&O? And the answer is yes, yourself. That's what this entire presentation is about. At the end of the day, agents have responsibility. You are licensed to perform a duty to not just your firm and to all the parties involved, but also your client, to the industry. This whole presentation is about how there has to be some level of competence in this arena on this, just by virtue of you having your license and participating in this practice. Just like for us as lawyers, it's the same thing. So the things that will protect you are exactly the things that we talked about today. And so make sure you're implementing as many of these things as you possibly can, and to use the resources that are available to you on the fly. If you get in a particular situation, you've got resources available to you. Tiffany and Fred, thank you so much for joining us today. Really informative, and hopefully I guess my feeling about this is much like when the wire fraud scams started, there was a learning curve and an educational curve. And I think we're in that curve right now. But I do have faith that much like the wire fraud scams, as agents become more versed in this, we will see less and less of these sorts of instances, and we'll see, hopefully the tide will recede a little bit on the number of scams we're seeing in this arena. But anyway, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank
you for having us. Yeah.
All right. Well, Savannah, unless you got anything else for me, I think we can sign off. Again, one last reminder. If we didn't get your question, feel free to contact the commission or the NC Realtors legal hotline. And these slides will be going out. Savannah, do you intend to email the participants the slides and things like that?
Yes. So what we will do is I will get all of the materials together and we will email all of the participants, as well as have the webinar on demand on our website at ncrealtors.org. So I know that everybody really appreciates all 3 of you taking time to address this particular subject. And I hope that everybody is able to leave today with some tokens of important knowledge.
All right. Thanks very much. Thanks for all for joining us. I'm going to sign off.
Thank you. Goodbye.